Good evening. My name's Tom Hughes and I'm a storyteller. And I'm absolutely delighted to be taking part once again in the Festival of Folklore, organised by Mostly Ghostly. And a special thank you to yourselves for joining us here online for this special virtual version of it this year. Now, I'm sitting here in the surroundings of the old tolbooth in Sanquhar in Upper Nithsdale. Upper Nithsdale being a sort of spiritual home of the Festival of Folklore, but quite far inland. But this year, 2020, amongst all the other many things which it's been, it is Scotland's year of coasts and waters. So for a while, I thought I would share some stories, some dark tales from Scotland's shores, to venture out around the coastline of the country. Scotland is a country which has had many relationships with the sea being a highway to carry people between the many islands of this land. Also to provide a bounty of fish for the fishermen and to bring exotic goods from foreign lands into Scotland. But the sea can be dangerous, and those who made their living by these waters, or those who had to cross to see family on some of the islands, or perhaps just to go and venture to collect their food, it could be a very dangerous place. And it was only natural that some of the fears of the sea and what it could do would trickle over into the stories and the folklore, and I'll be sharing some of those stories now. But these stories are being collected by a great tradition of storytellers who've gone before us all, and I'll be telling you some of their tales and passing them on. And the one that I think I'll start with is one that stuck with me when I first visited the house where it happened, and this certainly shaped the life perhaps of the person who it happened to, because this relates to Hugh Miller, the geologist, stonemason and journalist, and the great collector of folklore and curiosities and indeed stories. And Hugh Miller was a native of Cromarty, and that town, well, it had been shaped by the sea itself. But a story, one of his early memories, was this. Hugh Miller was in their house, a thatched cottage, well, quite a large house for the town, and his mother was sitting by the fireplace, sewing, repairing, when suddenly the front door blew open, and his mother said to her 5-year-old son, Hugh, go to close the door. And he made his way to the door, but there in front of him, reaching out towards him, he saw a hand and forearm of livid appearance, sodden appearance, stretching before him, almost dripping. And as he looked, he saw nothing else beyond it, nothing but blank, transparent space where the body should be. And it is reached, almost pointing for him. It seemed to be the hand of a woman, but then it disappeared. His mother had seen nothing, but word came within a couple of days that Hugh's father had drowned at that moment. The door had blown open. And so with such a beginning, it's perhaps no surprise that he set about collecting all of the curiosities. Another that I'll tell to you now is a tale of the grey cairn. Now Hugh Miller, he described all the kind of folklore and the traditions of his surrounding area. In fact, much of the Black Isle. But he said there were many cairns in the vicinity of Cromarty, ancient burial mounds, or just places where stones had been laid to mark a burial spot. One place had even had all the stones from that cairn had been taken away, enough to almost build a whole house with, and so in such ways cairns were lost. But he recorded the story of a fisherman who was making his way back from his travels, and he had been walking quite a number of miles. He was nearing Cromarty, but perhaps still 2-3 miles away. And there, as he came to what was known as the Grey Cairn, a larger cairn, the fisherman saw around not the usual fir saplings that would be there and the cows lowing or just the bird song, but no, things went dark, and where the trees would have been, well, a mist rolled in, and the fisherman could hear the sound of waves slamming against the cliff. And being a fisherman, he was well acquainted with that sound, but he knew that the nearest shore was 2 miles away, and the nearest cliff a further mile than that. But here, appearing through the mist in front of him, was a sea. He even saw 2 spectral vessels sailing past each other and then disappearing, and the mist clearing. Were those stones of the cairn the markers for a burial of somebody who died in a storm at sea? In such ways, the folklore of the sea could permeate even inland. But in some places, there's not so much of an inland because Scotland has many islands. And the next tale that I will tell to you is one from Orkney, from the Isle of Stronsay. And there, a woman, she had a dream one night that her husband, a fisherman, would be going out the next day, but a terrible storm would blow up and that he would be drowned. And it was such a vivid dream that she was sure this was what was going to happen. And when she awoke from it, she would not let her husband leave the house for fear that her dream may turn to reality. And so she gave him every reason, every excuse that he should not go to his usual business, should not go to sea that day. She forced him to stay at home. And he said, well, if I must stay at home, there's still these tasks that need to be done. You can't go to sea, for such a thing would be very unlucky. But you can carry out all these other jobs. So that day, she went off to do the task that her husband had, save that of going to sea, and left him there in their cottage. Well, he went and got on with a few jobs that he could do there in the cottage, and as he was working through the day, a terrible thirst came upon him, and he saw over in the corner the butter churn, the churn with the buttermilk at the bottom of it, and he thought, a little buttermilk will just quench my thirst. And he looked in, but it was quite deep down to the level of the buttermilk, and he reached in, and as he did, he toppled and he fell in such a way that he was stuck there, his head under the buttermilk, and he drowned. And drowning was very much a fear for all those connected with the sea. Elsewhere in Orkney, on another island, Ronaldsay, South Ronaldsay, there was a tale here recorded of a man and his daughter who shared a house, and in the evenings they would sit together by the fireplace sharing conversation of what they'd done in the day, and then it would come to a time when they would each go to their beds at each end of the house, box beds. And the father, he went to bed, and his daughter sat up a while, and the next day she said, Father, it was terribly queer when you'd gone to bed. A man came through the door. He came in, he sat next to me, and he just made me so uneasy, and he just talked and talked, and it just wasn't quite right. And the father said, well, you've not barred the door properly. Tonight I'll make sure. So that night, before he went to his box bed, the father, he went and he made sure the wooden bar was across the door so that nobody would enter. And that night, once he was tucked up in his box bed, his daughter still sitting by the embers of that fire, she saw the man come through the door again and sit by her and make her so uneasy. And so she told her father in the morning. This man wouldn't go away the whole night. He stayed there until eventually I drifted off to sleep, and he was gone. And the father said, well, this must be the sea man. and I don't know what to do for you, but I can meet him this time. So that evening, the daughter went first to her box bed, and then the father, sitting up by the fire, he saw through that door the seaman did indeed come in and sat by the fire as well, and it made him feel uneasy. And they sat there, and the seaman made no sense that he was going to move, that he was going to leave. But they had a conversation, and the father said to the seaman, I've got terrible trouble with one of my cows. You see, she's out in the byre, and every night she's visited by a bull seal. And the bull seal, well, he's going to be the ruin of my cow, and I don't know what to do with it. And the seaman said, is that it? Well, that's easily solved. All you need to do is take some parings from your cow's hooves and cut a bit of her hair and place that above the door, and the bull seal will never be able to pass through. Well, the next day, the father, he cut some of his daughter's hair and he trimmed her fingernails and he put them above the door and he barred it. And that night, as father and daughter sat up, they heard a banging at the door, but the seaman could not get in. And outside, they heard the seaman cursing that he had been his own undoing. So you'll know just how to keep yourself safe if you're visited by the seaman. Now the next tale I should like to tell to you, another dark tale, was collected and shared by the great Scottish traveller, storyteller Stanley Robertson, and I came across this and it made a real impact on me, and I should tell it and share it with you now. In a small fishing village of the Ely Roar, it was getting near to the Samhain, the night of Halloween, and on the Samhain all those in the Ely Roar, they would collect food, a bit of spare drink, and they'd leave it out on their doorsteps for the souls of those who had been died in the past year or indeed in the years before that. And that was a way of keeping the dead happy and themselves safe inside. Now the village of the Ely Roar, it stretched down to the sea, and the smallest of harbours, no large ships could dock there, only the smallest of fishing boats, and so it was a poor village, the Ely Roar. And on the night of the Samhain, when everybody was making the preparations to leave outside their homes, they had no time really for Maggie Menny, the old woman who lived at the top of the Ely Roar. They had their own worries to take care of, but Maggie, well, her worries weren't about putting food out for the dead. Her worries were how death might come to seek her. See, 10 years earlier, on the night of the Samhain, there had been a terrible storm, while her husband, Jimmy, and her son, Andrew, had been out at sea, and a terrible storm had blown up, and Jimmy and Andrew had never returned, leaving poor Maggie Menny alone. And so she always feared that night of the Samhain. And here it was, everybody else had prepared. They put their food and their drink outside and closed their shutters. Maggie, well, she was huddled in her home, almost not daring to look out, but not being able to resist it either. And she looked from her cottage at the top of the Ely Roar, down the wet cobbled row, down towards the harbour, and there, seeing the waves lapping against the edge of the harbour, and then a light. And she looked at the light. It lit up the shape of a figure, a tall man, a tall bearded man. And she looked, and she was drawn to it, but she didn't dare leave her house, but she had to keep looking as this figure came up the harbour steps, one by one, carrying with it a fish cleek, and with every step a clink, clink, clink on the cobbles, and another step with a clink, clink, clink on the cobbles. The figure was drawing closer and closer to Maggie's house, and here it was on the cobbles, getting closer and closer, and Maggie's cottage at the top. He was definitely bound for her cottage. He was not deviating to any others. He didn't stop for any of the food that was laid out. He was definitely coming towards Maggie, and she was drawn to the door, but then too scared to step out. And a clink, clink, clink on the cobbles of the fish cleek carried by this tall bearded man, and he came closer and closer until he was at the door. And Maggie was silent, not wanting to make a single noise. But then there was a knock, knock, knock at the door, and the voice said, "Mother." And Maggie, she opened the door, and the figure, the tall bearded man, stepped inside. "Mother." And she said, "Andrea, my son, but you were drowned. You were drowned 10 years ago this night." Said the mother, "No, my father was drowned, but I was rescued. I was rescued on a Norwegian ship, and they took me to their land, and it's taken me all this time to get back, but here I am now, back." And she realised that was the gift of the Samhain, the time when the dead come to visit the living, and here was her son, safe back with her. So a happier tale amongst the darkness. And I'll be telling some more a little later on, but thank you very much for listening so far.